So, traveling alone, reporting without a crew. I was joking that he has his backpack with him, but you carry a backpack of portable digital technology to shoot, write, edit, and transmit multimedia reports from around the world. Besides all of that, now you're teaching in Hong Kong, which we were just talking about. So I think that, even though I made more notes here, I think that the best thing is to just let you talk and people ask questions. But so
Fantastic.
with that, I will leave the floor to you. Oh, and the book, of course, which we really look forward to reading. I'm glad they sent
Stacks
a
of it
bunch
over
of
there.
copies over. Thank you to the alumni. Was this alumni or was it? Did you say
Yeah, it was
alumni?
Belinda, I think, that
Yeah.
brought him in.
So thank you very much for that and for the books and for the food and everybody grab a copy of the book and read it and talk about it on social media and Twitter and Facebook.
There you
so
go.
we can,
Thank you, Josh. Yeah,
so
if
people
you
will
have a
buy it.
plate of food, then you have to get a book, okay? That's a requirement.
have to
The
tweet.
fact that you're actually here
Yeah.
has probably more to do with lunch than with me, but I appreciate it. I haven't been here in a long time. I graduated in 1989. We weren't using typewriters at that point, but we were close. For you guys, you probably don't know what a typewriter is. We'll talk about it after the presentation. But when I left here, I had dreams of doing a lot of different things. I never really dreamed that I was going to be a war correspondent. It was one of those situations where circumstances happen to you, and I got sent to a conflict zone a couple of times when I was at NBC, and once I got into that cycle, they decided, oh, you have war experience now, we're going to continue to send you back. And it just so happened that time ended up being around the 9/11 attacks, so it ended up being 10 years later. I never quite got out of the war zones. Fortunately, I did survive them and was able to kind of share my experiences with people, which is what I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to make this as informal as possible and also as brief as possible because we're a small group. We should have a conversation rather than a presentation. And quite frankly, I'm a little bit tired of talking. I did George Mason yesterday, and the classes were much different. They were undergrads, and they're wide-eyed and idealistic, and I know that you guys are hard-bitten journalists, so we'll get right to the dirty stuff. The thing that I talked to them about yesterday that was interesting is I gave them this overview of backpack journalism and how, for me, the whole concept of it was really just shrinking the footprint. Part of it was perhaps that I'm very difficult to get along with. You can ask my wife that. No one wanted to work with me after a while, so I found a way to do television by myself, which no one seemed to complain about. But the other idea was I was very jealous of my print brethren, the fact that they could go and have an initiative to talk to someone without changing the environment to the same degree that we as broadcast journalists or electronic journalists were changing the environment. We would go in there, we'd set up a $50,000 Ikegami camera, drop a fuzzy bunny mic in front of them, put a light on them, and who doesn't react to that? You either become a deer in the headlights or you become a public relations professional. And either way, you're getting further and further from the truth. And that point was made very clear to me one of the last assignments I did for NBC as a staff producer before I switched into the backpack journalism mode and started doing on-camera reporting. But I was interviewing an Albanian farmer who had been talking about a Serbian incursion into his area and his territory, and the fact that when they came across, they started killing farm animals, shooting up the barns, and that everyone there, him included, fled. They took off, ran for safety into the hills. And by the time I found him and I started talking to him, I had somehow got separated from my crew, but I was carrying a high-8 video camera. So I said, okay, I don't know where my guys are. Let's go ahead and do this interview. And I went ahead and I shot this interview with him, and he was very humble. He started speaking to me about exactly what happened, that they had crossed over, they were wearing all black, they were terrifying, and that he and his family fled to the hills. About 10 minutes later, after I finished that interview, my crew showed up, and we put together the monstrous set that is broadcast news in these remote areas at that time, and we did another interview with him. And I saw the transition from this very humble farmer to this badass Kosovo Liberation Army guerrilla who was fighting back against the Serbians, who was protecting his family, and was doing all he could to protect the homeland. And so I said, okay, which of these stories is the truth? And my supposition was that there wasn't an audience at this point. There was just he and I, and that discussion was probably closer to what happened. And it made me think, how many stories are we changing by the equipment? I'm not a technology expert. I'm actually pretty bad at this stuff. I had to learn how to shoot. I had to learn how to edit, simply because I felt like if you want to control the story, if you want to not have to tell, a videographer, I want this shot, if you don't want to have to stand behind someone's back and call an edit, you need to be aware of all of these tools that are available to you. And then you can tell the story through your own vision. So that idea initially for backpack journalism was to shrink the footprint, to become less of a part of the process and more of a fly on the wall. And I began to see the advantages of it almost immediately. I was able to go places that I wasn't able to go with the military or with insurgents or whoever I wanted to talk. I didn't make much of a fuss. I was very low-key. And the stories that I felt that I was getting were improving. But there was a big downside to it. And that downside, well, there's a couple of them. One was the technological aspects. As a one-person band working in multimedia, I've got a video camera on my right-hand side, a still camera on my left, a notebook in my hand, and a backpack on my back. Which tool do you use first? Which is the story that you're going to tell first? Because in some ways, they can be mutually exclusive. Doing a nice long-form magazine piece in text, as Josh would tell us, there's an art to that, and it isn't necessarily helped by a television camera. In fact, it's probably hurt by a television camera. That intimacy is lost. And also, are you able to make an introduction to someone when you have all of this gear in front of you? This becomes the way that you say hello with a lot of whirring machines and so on, rather than human contact. So for me, I had to figure out which medium I would use and when I would use it. And my solution to this was, I'm a human being first. I need to connect with you as a human being. There's nothing. There's no notebook. There's nothing but my handshake and my eyes, talking to you, making a connection as a human being. As the information starts to come out, then maybe the notebook comes out, and we begin to take some notes. It's a process of not jumping in the deep end all at once, but putting your little toe in, and then your big toe, and then getting in and immersing in the whole story. I also said to myself that if there was motion, if someone was singing, dancing, if something was exploding in front of me, video was the medium. And if that happened, as soon as I walked in there, that's what I had to do. And then I made a rule for the still photography as well. For me, still photography, since I wasn't an expert at it, would be about faces. I wanted every story to begin with a human face, especially when it's coming off the internet. You're already interfacing with a machine, not a piece of paper, not something that can be unintimidating like something inanimate, but a machine that's whirring and has buttons and so on can be intimidating to us. So let's start with a human face. Let's bring them into the story that way and convince our readers, our viewers, that this is about a human being rather than an issue. And that the text of the story would explain the nuance. Words are amazing if you're good with them to explain what's happening on the subtext level beneath the surface. Bringing all those elements together as a multimedia reporter, marrying them into a piece that speaks to us in nuance, in motion, and in the human poetry of the face, can tell a story in 3 dimensions rather than 1 dimension, so much more complete. And I felt that was becoming very effective once I had figured out the difficulties of handling all of the multimedia. But the true downside of being this backpack journalist was that you really didn't have anyone to bounce ideas off of. I think one of the things that we like as journalists, even though we have difficulty with our colleagues at times, is the sense of collaboration. Journalists may not be the nicest people in the world, but they're some of the smartest. And being able to talk with them and gain some insight of what they think of your story, your approach to it, all of those elements was invaluable in my career at Network and very lost to me when I was working on my own. And also, I think colleagues can protect you from your worst instincts. If you're making a bad choice in the story, they may be able to talk you out of it. You have to have the strength of your convictions, obviously, but it's also important to, hey, am I just being crazy here? Because a lot of times you are being crazy, especially when you're spending 367 days in a war zone, or war zones, as was the case for me in doing this hot zone project for Yahoo. I mean, I literally was going to a country every 10 days. And the only research that I could actually do was the research that I did on the plane. I would land in a location, have to find a fixer, and begin telling stories the day that I landed.
And there weren't usually Starbucks there for Wi-Fi? So.
Unfortunately, no. You could find some internet cafes, and maybe that was the way I had to file. But for the most part, you're finding someone to help you tell that story through their language, navigate both the political and geographic landmines, and sometimes the physical landmines of that environment. So that whole process was liberating, but also daunting, kind of unsettling in some ways. And when you spend too much time in your own head, you can figure out that sometimes you're not always doing the right thing. And what I wanted to talk to you today was not that process of backpack journalism, but the consequences of perhaps reporting alone, sometimes too long, and losing sense of humanity. One of the dilemmas that we face as journalists is, when do we actually put the camera down? I think one of the things that brought this in full relief to us very recently was the incident in New York where there was a gentleman that was pushed in front of the subway. And the freelancer that was able to snap off 42 frames before the train hit this person, actually to take pictures but not to save him. And there's no judgment here from me, because I've been in that same situation and I've done the same thing and not responded as a human being but as a journalist. And in some ways, you want to question, could he have saved him, or was he doing exactly the right thing as a journalist, which our response is to bear witness to what happens and to make sure everybody knows about it. But there is a consequence to being a reporter first and not necessarily responding to your human instincts, which is really what I wanted to talk to you about, because in conflict, I found that there were 3 different occasions when I actually had a chance to get out of a war zone. I did a Neiman Fellowship at Harvard. A great thing. When you guys are mid-career journalists, apply for that. It's the greatest thing that will happen to you. You get to go to Harvard. They pay you to be there and do nothing but take classes. You don't have to pay them to take classes. They pay you to take classes. You never get graded. You just audit these things, and you're around some of the smartest people you'll ever meet. But the problem for me is I didn't have time to really think about what I had been doing in conflict or in reporting all these years until I got to Harvard. And I started writing this particular book. And I thought about, well, I've done a pretty good job covering war so far, and I felt confident in what I had been doing as a reporter. But then I started to look at some of the incidents where I didn't do such a good job as a human being. And I realized that the cost that had for me in terms of creating something that I never thought I would get from being in conflict, which were the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. You think this is reserved only for combatants or victims caught in the crossfire, but sometimes journalists can get it as well, and I began to realize that was something I was experiencing. But it was very confusing to me, because the typical definition of PTSD was witnessing a traumatic event that would be reoccurring in your mind to the point where it really prevented you from living a normal life. It would become this kind of feedback loop that never gave up. And you would remember the trauma or the horror of the incident. And the strange thing for me was, I've seen some really horrible things, but they never affected me that way. At a certain point, I got numb to them, but people are incredibly resilient. We can witness horrible tragedy. We can see things that are very ugly, and we respond to them by initial shock, but there's a period in which we get over it. And so I didn't feel that what I had seen or witnessed was really debilitating, but it was the things that I had done and I had failed to do that became such a big problem for me. And it became this focus of guilt. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is a new concept, which is really kind of replacing the whole idea of PTSD as the major issue that soldiers and Marines are facing, when in fact it may be this concept called moral injury. Moral injury in the context of war was a study done by the Veterans Administration in 2009. It's brand new information in the sense that it hasn't been widely disseminated yet. There's been some reporting on it, but it's starting to get traction now. And the idea behind it is that moral injury, like PTSD, revolves around traumatic events, but it's not necessarily the witnessing of traumatic events that causes it. It's the idea that your involvement somehow has played with your moral compass. It's violated it. Most of this, in terms of actual combatants, revolves around two things. Actually killing a person either in the line of duty or accidentally in a blue-on-blue incident where you kill your own men, or killing an innocent civilian by accident. So killing directly. The other is surviving killing, actually surviving when your friends have died, survivor's guilt. So it's guilt based on killing or surviving in war. And after I wrote this book, I didn't see the study until after I completed it, and I looked at all of the profiles that were part of this book, 11 different soldiers and Marines, 6 of them who I had been deployed with in the past, guys that I met in Iraq or in Afghanistan. 3 of them had come from the Vietnam War, guys that I met later on. A couple of them had come from different armies. One was Israeli Defense Forces and one was the Royal Netherlands Marines. But all of these different combatants experienced the same level of guilt in one of those categories, either guilt for killing or guilt for surviving. And it really made me see that their difficulties in re-entry may have been part of that process. So to bring this all together for you, during that year at Harvard, I had a chance to explore where my guilt came from. And it really came from 3 different areas, and I just want to briefly connect you to them. Do you guys remember this particular clip from Full Metal Jacket, the Private Joker clip, talking about the duality of man? I want to show that to you, but I think I'll show it to you after I get through these slides because I can't necessarily bring it up online here. It messes up my PowerPoint in a way, and it takes me 2 hours to get back to it. But this is that point where Private Joker is questioned by the colonel. Son, why do you have "Born to Kill" on your helmet and a peace button on your body armor? And he says, sir, I think I'm trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir. And the general says, what? He says, the duality of man, sir, you know, the Jungian thing. And what he was talking about is a very funny part of the movie, if you've studied any psychology or just aware of Jungian's concept of the shadow self, is we have this part of us in our nature, the shadow self, that despite our feelings about our own goodness or our convictions about being good human beings, we have the ability to do things that are not so good. In war, that's easy to see. You take someone from a farm or the inner city or anywhere else in America, you put a gun in their hands and you say, this is your enemy, kill them, and they do it, you come back changed. Does that affect their moral compass? Most definitely. Even if they can be assured that what they did was in the line of duty. To that same end, where does that ability to transgress our normal moral code come from? How can we override what we've learned in peacetime society to do things in war that we didn't expect to do? And so that concept of the shadow self is something that I really struggled with in 3 different areas. I got so obsessed with this. I'm a freak for the whiteboard. Everything I do, I write on the whiteboard first. I guess I'm traditionally more low-tech than I think. And I found 3 incidents where I had done things that I was guilty over, kind of ashamed over, and really never talked to anybody about them. And I just want to share them with you briefly. The first was this incident. It was in northern Afghanistan, and I ended up in that little sliver of territory in northern Afghanistan shortly after 9/11. This is a couple weeks into September, right after the attacks. I went over with NBC. I crossed the Amu Darya River with some Russian soldiers that were still in charge of security in Tajikistan at the time. And then I got picked up by some Northern Alliance troops, and we were taken to Massoud's compound, the same place that he had been assassinated a few weeks earlier. And we began covering this war from the front lines. And we would ride out on horses to this trench area where the combat was taking place between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. And what you're going to see here is an exchange that happened. It was a Taliban mortar that landed very close to us and did some damage, and I'll tell you my reaction to it in a second. Wow, that was close. The Taliban fired a mortar shell that landed very close to me, maybe no more than 20 feet from me. It exploded, and some of the shrapnel hit a National Geographic producer that was standing right next to me. Get on this side. Get on the other side. Let's get on the other side of the tank. Back there. Other side. Other side. Okay, so This is a very interesting situation for a reporter, especially someone just getting into a war zone where you haven't seen any pictures or video of what incoming rounds look like. We see a lot of things being shot in another direction. Very seldom do we see people being wounded on our lines. I mean, that's changing a little bit in Syria with this stuff being shot by the actual combatants. But this was the first video that I know of a Westerner. You know, it was a journalist, it wasn't a soldier, but of someone actually being wounded in exchange with the Taliban. So it happened in front of me, and my instinct is keep shooting this. You know, this is fascinating stuff. Now, this guy got hit in the not in the femoral artery, but he got hit in the upper thigh, right next to the femoral artery. And any of us that know a little bit about physiology know that if you hit the femoral artery, it's a major artery, probably the biggest in the body. You're going to bleed out in 4 minutes. You're going to die. I didn't know whether this hit his femoral artery or not. I was taking a guess that it didn't because I kept on shooting. This is a moment when I didn't put down the camera. Now, I wasn't alone with him. There were some other people there. But I was shooting for a few minutes, and he even said, "Hey, you're shooting this, aren't you?" He wanted me to continue. I said, "Okay, yeah, I am." But I started to feel maybe this is a little bit wrong. You know, this guy's bleeding. Maybe I should do something about it. So do I stop shooting, or do I keep on doing this, you know, or find some other way? So I compromised, and I did both. I put the camera down, but I left it rolling. I grabbed his scarf, and I wrapped him up. So he actually lived. But I had to think about it later on because I recounted the story to people, and I actually told them about it. They go, "Why didn't you wrap him up right away? You know, why weren't you concerned about his life?" And I told them quite honestly because I didn't like the guy that much. And I'm half kidding. It wasn't that. They're like, "What? You are a monster. You deserve everything that you have, jerk." No, it was really a situation where I was conflicted about it, and I have him egging me on to keep on shooting it as well. But that was the first time I had to decide, are you a journalist, or are you a human being? Are you both? How do you do both jobs? How do you do both jobs effectively? My rap job wasn't great on him. You know, I'm not a paramedic, but you know, it was okay. And my shooting wasn't great, but I ended up getting both. But it made me think, made me question, are you a good person or are you a bad person? I never in a million years in peacetime society would have seen someone hurt in a car accident and not run to their aid. I had been a lifeguard, for God's sake. That's what I wanted to do, was save people. You know, and in this case, I ignored it to do my job, didn't put my camera down. The second incident was actually a little bit more disturbing, and this is where it upped the threshold level for me and began to make me think, you know, you are not such a good person at all. This is a situation in Fallujah, Iraq, November 2004. Operation Phantom Fury, and the effort was to push the insurgents out of Fallujah following the killing of the Blackwater contractors there. You may remember that incident where 4 Blackwater contractors were killed. Their bodies were burned and strung up on a bridge in Fallujah. This was the effort to take back control of the city from the insurgents, and basically the U.S. military, the Marines, said that they had enough. The rules of engagement were very liberal in this conflict. There's a lot of killing going on. One of the first ones that I saw was this older Iraqi man that you see in the far right-hand corner of the screen. You see that trail of blood. This is a man that had been shot by a Marine sniper. And when I first saw him, I saw the blood going out, and I saw he was wearing a T-shirt. I remember this very specifically. His chest was raising and dropping. He was still breathing. And then I went to the other side of him, to the left side, and I saw that half of his skull was missing. And it was a shot that blew away the back of his head, the exit wound. And I was amazed that he was still alive. It freaked me out that this guy, you know, had half of a head gone and he's an agonal breath, still alive. And the Marines come up to me and they say to me, "Are you going to videotape this if we shoot him?" And in that moment, I became the arbiter of this guy's final moments. If I say yes, they can off him. Or if I say, no, go ahead and shoot him, I'm not going to videotape it, they can off him. And then it's almost my responsibility. If I say no, I am going to videotape this, am I preventing a mercy killing where this guy is suffering terribly and I just prevented him from being put out of his misery? You know, it was a really weird dilemma for me, and I didn't think about it. I said, yes, of course I'm going to videotape this. My instinct as a journalist, yes, of course I would. And so they shrugged their shoulders and said, I'm not going to prison over this. And they walked away. and they left me alone with that guy. And so his last moments were spent with this stupid American with a camera looking over him, doing nothing. What do you do at that moment? Do you try to wrap him up, protect him, do whatever else you can to maybe save his life? And I thought, no, he's going to die. This is it. There's no first aid possible for him. But what could you do as a human being? Could you put the camera down for a second, squeeze his hand, give him a few last moments of comfort or whatever? That's probably not a bad idea. But to me, the circumstances at that moment didn't seem right to do that. To me, I felt in some ways, well, I need the trust of these Marines to do my job here. Are they going to think that I'm giving aid and comfort to the enemy if I'm squeezing this guy's hand? Am I getting all emotional over this person? And so I looked at him and I walked off. And I joined the battle, and I didn't think about him again till a year or so later when I saw the videotape. And I saw his chest rising and heaving. And then you begin to think, did I make the right decision there? Am I a bad person by what I did? Was I just being a journalist doing my job? So that was number 2. Now, number 3 is the worst thing that I've ever done in my life. And this is a situation, some of you may be familiar with it. I'm not going to go into great details. It is in the book. But in that same battle in 2004, I videotaped a U.S. Marine executing an unarmed insurgent in a Fallujah mosque. This was a big incident. I was with NBC at that time. We censored the videotape. We didn't show the whole shooting. Later on, since I was a freelancer, I said that was the wrong thing to do. I was part of that decision-making process, but I rethought it, didn't think it was right. And I released it on my blog, the videotape, and a big article explaining everything that happened there. But there was another insurgent in that mosque that was still very much alive after that initial execution. His name was Medill. And I remember that after I videotaped this and the Marines again left the mosque, I went over and I saw him, and he tries to speak to me. He's speaking to me in Arabic. He had no weapons on him. He had been disarmed earlier. He was nothing in his underwear. He was only slightly wounded. He had a leg wound. And he begins talking to me, and he starts saying, "You remember me. I was here the day before. You saw me. You saw me with the others. I have something to tell you." And the only reason I know what he was saying is because I had someone translate it on the videotape later on. I had no idea what he was saying as he was speaking to me. I don't speak Arabic. I didn't know it at the moment. And I looked at him, and I said, "I don't know." And then I walked out of the building. And then I never found out this until about 2 to 3 years later. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get the Naval Criminal Investigative Services report on the mosque shooting. And I remember this because I was just starting to write my first book in the Hot Zone, following the Hot Zone project. And it was a Manhattan phone book document. And I started flipping through it. And in some weird way, my moral compass was telling me, you need to go to this section where it talks about the specific shooting and the aftermath. And I did. And I started reading a paragraph, and I remember at that point my heart dropped into my stomach because I read the name and the description. Insurgent, or I think they termed it Anti-Iraqi Forces, AIF. That was the acronym they were using for insurgents at the time. An AIF wearing a plaid shirt and bloodstained underwear was found, who was alive during the initial reconnaissance, was found dead, 23 rounds in his back. And they were 5.56 caliber NATO, 5.56 NATO, which is what U.S. military uses in its M4, its basic military assault rifle. So I was reporting on an execution that I saw in a Fallujah mosque, and my first instinct as a journalist was to go to the commanding officer, to show him the videotape and get his reaction to it as a reporter. But what I didn't do at that moment was walk out another person that was in danger of being killed and save his life. And so another execution happened after I walked out to do my job. Not being aware of the circumstances, I unwittingly became complicit in a murder. And no matter what you say, you didn't mean to do it, or that was something that was just an accident. The consequences are a man is dead. So you can't take that back. Even if it was an accident, it was an accident. You didn't mean to do it, that's fine. but it says something, and it said something to me. It said, you might be ultimately aware of your surroundings as a reporter, but you're woefully aware of your surroundings as a human being. And you just let another man die, and there's another story in that. And the problem was, everyone was so war fatigued. By the time I started reporting this side of it, no one even cared. This made no news whatsoever. This probably more conclusively was a murder. The first shooting, I'm sure, was an execution as well, but there could be arguments made. He felt like he was in danger. He wasn't certain. This guy had no weapons on him. He was in his underwear. It was clear. There was nothing around him. And he was shot 23 times in the back. What that makes me think is that he was crawling away. That's how someone gets shot in the back. So those three things, pretty heavy stuff, huh? And it made me think, wow, you thought you did such a good job covering war, but you certainly didn't realize the consequences of your reporting. I never thought I would be in a moral dilemma of this magnitude, all of these magnitudes, that you actually have to accept your complicity in someone's death. So I began to think about this, and it really rocked my world. It made me start to believe that you can never be forgiven for something like this because you can't take it back. And I began to exhibit further symptoms of post-traumatic stress, began manifesting itself through self-destructive behavior, risk-taking, alcohol abuse, that kind of thing. And I also, because I was a journalist, couldn't stop writing or speaking about it. So I was getting all these requests to talk about what happened, and I felt like I can't talk about my reporting without talking about the mistakes that I made while doing it. And so I began to come clean about these incidents. Yes, I covered this, but here's where I didn't really pay attention to my human side. And I found out that some of that reporting and some of that speaking mitigated some of the PTSD. It made me feel a little bit better. Being a reporter, we're so cause and effect. I started to think, if it helped me, if the storytelling process was somehow cathartic, it's no big aha moment. The Greeks have been doing it, through their plays, and the ancient Romans and Native Americans talk about their wars around their campfires. It wasn't a new idea, but I saw it firsthand how it helped. Maybe it can help soldiers or Marines and other service people when they come back. And so that was the idea for the book, The Things They Cannot Say. What were the experiences they brought back from war that they couldn't share with society? As a journalist, I had a mandate to talk about these things. As soldiers, they don't. They almost have a mandate not to talk about it, to keep it all inside, to be that strong Marine and not show any signs of weakness. To not talk about killing as it's actually a part of the job. It is a part of the job. It's the main part of the job. But the idea is to stay as far away from it as you can. And we in society are somewhat complicit in that as well, because we decide to lump them all together, give them a pat on the back and say, thank you for your service, where each individual has a unique war experience that is incredibly complex, that may contain moments of heroism, that may contain moments of war crimes, or absurdity, or moments when they think it's funny, or they feel very powerful, and it's not politically correct to say I felt powerful in war. And so all of those things coming back, who do you share that with? Someone that hasn't been in conflict? No, because they're not going to understand. And because they also give these guys indicators that they don't want to hear it. Thank you for your service. We don't want you to have to relive that war experience. You're home now. We're happy you're in one piece. Maybe one piece physically, but maybe not psychologically. So the idea behind the book was really, it ultimately was catalyzed by my own experiences. But seeing storytelling as that first pathway to overcoming moral injury. Not the guilt, not the trauma of seeing something, but the idea of being guilty over committing a killing, surviving a killing, doing something wrong, or not doing something at all when you needed to do something, and trying to find a place where catharsis can exist. And this kind of concept, the concept of moral injury, turns our protocols for treating returning vets completely on its head. The protocol for PTSD is recounting the experience over and over again in a clinical fashion, getting all the details out so it almost becomes numb and it doesn't even bother you anymore. The protocol for moral injury is the idea of healing and forgiveness, that you seek forgiveness for what you feel like you've done, and you can only do that if you explain to someone what you've done. You can't be forgiven if a story is never told. So my goal for these 11 soldiers and Marines was the platform of giving them a chance and a medium to seek forgiveness or to seek just to share their story. Some of them didn't seek forgiveness. There are people in here that don't have guilt for killing. And it's because, a number of different factors. Some of them grew up in very difficult rural poverty where they can compartmentalize like no one I've ever seen. And maybe it doesn't bother them. And for them, it's great. They can get by, they can do this job, and they don't feel that there has been a conflict with their moral compass. The majority of them do. So I wanted to make sure that they could share their stories. But here's the very interesting aspect about it. There's a rebound effect. I also found out the more I talked about this, that continue to talk about it every day for a year, I started to relive those experiences, and the PTS went from getting less severe to more severe.
You
And
were reliving their experiences or yours?
It started with theirs in writing the book, and then it re-triggered mine because I had to tell them, partly to gain trust. Mm-hmm. This is something I'm dealing with as well. That helped in getting their trust. And so I saw this rebound effect, that if you relive your worst moments every single day, you're not getting past them and you're not making new memories. Mm-hmm. So the idea was, this can be like a uniform that you put in the attic. I wore this uniform when I had these experiences. I acknowledge that it exists. I acknowledge these experiences are there. I need to put it away. I'm not denying it, and I have shared it with the public, but I don't have to live there every day. I need to go on and move past this and have experiences that are new and that, that allow me to forgive myself. So that's basically the thesis of the book is that we need to look at war perhaps in a very different way. I think we as journalists have been complicit in some ways of increasing the mythology of conflict. We often look at war simply as combat. And I know from covering war for the last 10 years, sometimes you can't find combat in a war. Sometimes you don't find that. Sometimes you find armies amassed, but there isn't shooting, but there's still attrition from that war. A perfect example, Democratic Republic of Congo. 5.2 million people killed since 1997. And yet, we're not seeing those people killed in all-out battles. You don't really see all-out battles between these, many different guerrilla forces there in the Congolese army and the UN. What you see is attrition from war, sexual violence, landmines and cluster bombs which deny land use, so you can't farm it, so people starve to death, they get sick. That's where the attrition comes from. And I started doing research, and most of the evidence of past conflicts seem to indicate that civilians die in greater numbers in war than combatants ever do. Take that over time. It's not in the immediate course of the war, but in the aftermath of that war, there are direct correlations to civilians dying from that conflict because of illness, sickness, starvation, whatever has resulted, generational problems, the violence that it incurs from creating child soldiers, all of those things. And so looking at that, I began to try to understand that we needed to look at war in a much different way. War shouldn't be defined by combat. It should be defined by civil destruction or collateral damage. And one step further, we need to start including in collateral damage combatants, because they start to kill a little piece of themselves every time they pull the trigger. It doesn't happen right away. It may not happen in battle, but eventually it can happen. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. Some of the people that we think that are the most together, that seem to be at peace with their war experiences, someone like a Chris Kyle, America's most lethal sniper. 150 plus confirmed kills. The man was recently killed, as you know, murdered on a gun range. And he seemed to live a very productive life in the aftermath of having taken so many other lives. So what's this idea of moral injury? Why doesn't it affect someone like that? He started a business, he wrote a best-selling book, all of these things. Why does Eddie Ray Ruth, the kid that killed him, come apart when his combat exposure was limited, and someone that killed all these people can function fairly well. Fact is, both of them had PTSD. Both of them experienced reentry problems. Chris Kyle was taking medication to readjust from his time in combat. There wasn't any good transition for him immediately. But PTSD isn't like being a little bit pregnant, as Dave Grossman likes to say. You guys know that Dave Grossman, the author of On Killing, he was a lieutenant colonel, ranger, wrote this kind of seminal track. He followed it up with a pretty strange book on combat that seemed to kind of deny everything he said in On Killing. But he basically said PTSD isn't like being a little bit pregnant. You can't be a little bit pregnant. If you're pregnant all the way. If you have PTSD, it can be slight, like a Chris Kyle, or it can be incapacitating, like an Eddie Ray Ruth. You know, it can be all of these places in between, and we need to look at that. We need to look at war experiences as very complex and very unique. And so, you know, that was the idea of trying to look at this and not lump these guys into one place and say, thank you for your service. You know, not putting them in this place where you're all heroes. It makes my skin crawl when we say that. They're not all heroes. Some of them are. But if you call them all heroes, it diminishes the ones that are, that actually did incredibly difficult tasks out there, remained human in spite of it. It's like giving everybody a trophy in middle school. You were great. You know, you all won that race. No, you didn't. Someone did. And someone lost. So that was the concept with it.
Well, I just want to
please.
briefly. I mean, we did and by the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Josh Meyer. I work here at Medill on the faculty and help run a national security journalism initiative. So I just want to get out of the way. But we did a project last year on returning vets that were not full-scale Army and Marines, but that were the reserves and the National Guard, and about the problems they're facing, similar problems, PTSD. And throughout the military, whether it's active duty or not, the suicide rates right now are through the roof. I mean, I think it's far and away higher than it's ever been, and it's reached crisis proportions. I don't know.
349 suicides in 2012, which outpaced the number of combat deaths in Afghanistan, which were 295. This is almost one per day.
Yeah.
So the consequences of not beginning this healing process through storytelling are very dire.
Yeah.
So it's an incredible process that we don't have to wait for the VA to do this. You know, we as communities can be a part of this process. We as journalists can report on it differently. We can begin to look at the process of war from a holistic level. I'm as guilty as anybody else. I was seduced by the idea of combat. I remember very well, and kind of disturbingly so, right before we went to war in Iraq in 2003. I'm working for CNN, and I'm starting to think, I'm ready to go. You know, I kind of want this thing to happen. You know, obviously there was no real evidence to go to war at the time. It was a very destructive war. You know, by estimates, hundreds of thousands of people died in that conflict, and yet we're part of that process in, you know, revving up the info machine that supports the mythology of it. You know, not everything in war is bad. I mean, it can be a really complex experience, but we have to address that too. There are thrilling moments of it for individuals. And the other thing that we have to look at, I think the one part of The Hurt Locker that seemed to be pretty authentic to me, have you all seen the movie? Was that moment when Jeremy Renner comes back from conflict and he's in the grocery store aisle. And this is a guy that's diffusing bombs with no problem. He's pretty solid with that. He's pretty wired. But he gets in the cereal aisle and he's incapacitated because of all the choices. And what it highlighted very clearly was the sense of discontinuity. You know, being in a place where you're as powerful as you ever can be with the power over life and death. And then you're back in here making mundane decisions. You know, you're coming from combat, and then you're taking your job as someone that installs carpet. You know, that is a difficult transition, even if it is a good job, even if you don't have to fight someone. But we have to look at that aspect of it too. You know, the one thing that I would hope that we would kind of get out of this process is that, you know, war is a much more complex environment, and we can't report on it the way that we report on elections and everything else. It can't be this game. It can't be this contest that someone wins and someone loses. We need to use all the research that we have available to us, and we are getting more and more research. We're able to see that civilians, every time we declare war, civilians are going to die more than combatants, and that the consequences will be generationally long for all of us. So, I'm going to stop it there, because if you have some questions, I may be able to refer to some of the video and some of the stories that I have in the book about some of these specific things. There's some really interesting stories in the book that illustrate all the things that I'm talking about. People that have survived and really thrived, some stories of hope in here, and people that have not. People that have not been able to recover from the tailspin of returning from these conflicts. And some of it, I think, has to do with the intervention that they received beforehand. And we could talk about that in questions. How long were we going to go?
I think it's up to you.
Okay.
Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Like another 20 minutes or so.
Okay, sure. Yeah, why don't we go to questions? Yes.
I have kind of a general question about war correspondence. I was wondering, what do you think at this point is the best pathway into it? Do you think that freelancing is something that's too dangerous, or what is your kind of recommendation?
I think the best pathway into it is to think, why do you want to do it to begin with? And not to talk you out of it. You know, everybody wants some street credibility, and more reporting seems to be the quickest way to get it. But I'm not going to lie to you. It's the easiest kind of reporting there is. You know, I say this a lot, and I get a lot of flack for it. Any monkey can do it. It's not the fact that reporting on this kind of thing doesn't put you in danger. It does. We see people, our colleagues, getting killed, and we also see them being taken captive. But it's the difference between reporting on a fire and a city council meeting. If you go to that city council meeting, you have to listen, you've got to sit through the boredom, and you've got to sort through the things that are going to change people's lives. If you go to a fire is surface face value. Someone's house is burning down, someone's life is being affected. The immediate cause might not be known, but the result is someone may be homeless, someone is hurt. We can all relate to that very easily, and there's inherent drama. There's motion to it.
There aren't two or more sides to a fire.
Yeah, exactly. So that's part of the process, is that we can't look at this. There's a romanticized notion to it. And I was drawn to it, I think, I call them danger dilettantes. There's a lot of people that run out to a war zone. They haven't reported on anything before that, and they think that's going to give them street cred. And I've got to tell you, the young kids that are out there, the last deployment that I did to Afghanistan was one in which I really had my eyes open. I went and I reported on this, and I saw kids there that could run circles around me, technically. They could shoot, they could edit, they were great. What they didn't have was a sense of ethical understanding, what a true story was. I saw someone mount a GoPro on the top of a .50 caliber machine gun and turned this video into a first-person shooter game. Now, it's interesting video, it's fascinating, but video where you see someone getting shot down from the barrel of a gun, does that tell the story that we're trying to tell? Or does it tell a story at all? Does it simply pull us into this sense of fascination? And it is fascinating. This video can be very powerful, as we all know. And I realized that part of the problem with that, you guys have been loading videos to YouTube forever. They're usually raw videos, or maybe a little bit edited. What's the narrative? Is there something to be learned from this video that we're looking at? Is there a story that's been told? And most cases what I'm finding is that there aren't stories being told. We're being titillated by the value of inherent drama. That video of that .50 cal shooting someone doesn't tell me if someone won a war. It doesn't tell me the importance of that battle, if there was an importance of that battle. If that's the case, why don't we just put a GoPro on top of a war refugee's head? Let them see, their crying babies or whatever dirt and trash they see. It's not the same. What we're drawn to is the inherently dramatic. But the story in that refugee camp might be more important and tell the bigger story about the outcome of that war than that .50 cal footage does. That's where I start to have problems with what young journalists are doing out there. I appreciate their bravery. I appreciate their interest in it, and they should be interested in it. But can they go there and add to the dialogue? Are they going there to get captured? There are people that want to catch a bullet. That there's a goal for doing that. If you live, you're a hero and you have a story to tell. But you're becoming the story rather than reporting it. That's not where we want to be as journalists. We're there to tell someone else's story, not our own. We can write a first-person diary and give the background of what we're doing, but we're not there. Doing that says that we're more important than the people involved in that conflict, the combatants, the innocent civilians, everybody involved, and that's completely egocentric. and I've got a problem with that. So,
Can I ask you, help articulate your question too? I mean, I teach a class called Covering Conflicts, Terrorism, and National Security, and one of the things we go into deeply is the changing nature of combat. So when you talk about being a war correspondent, are you talking about literally being on the front lines in Afghanistan, or going to like Libya now, or Syria? I mean, a lot of this is urban. The lines between combat and conflict reporting, I think, are blurring. So, like, what do you?
I was referring more to being on the front lines, but also obviously, like Syria, I would be interested in that. I was just more curious if it's best to wait to be affiliated with the network like NBC, or if freelancers are, that's a good route as well.
you know what, that helps a lot. My feeling is that you're a reporter now. You're learning, but this is something that you want to do. You should be reporting. Do you need to be reporting from a conflict zone to add value to the dialogue, or debate that we have in our society? Absolutely not. Conflict is one of the problems that we face. War is one of the problems we face. There's so many things going on in this country right now that we're not focusing on, and it's hard to get people's attention. It really is. War is easy to report on because it gets everybody's attention for a little while, but it's the titillation effect that we focus on. When I finished the Hot Zone project, I pitched Yahoo. I said, let me do America in the Hot Zone. Let me do these untold stories of America. Let me go to the problem areas of our country and use the same method of backpack journalism and in-your-face kind of reporting. I had no interest in it. So part of our dilemma as journalists is telling the stories that people don't care if they get told or not, but that are incredibly important, and finding a way to make them inherently as dramatic as war.
Did they say why they weren't interested?
Well, part of it was financial, I'm sure. They spent a lot of money on my project, and I think part of it was that idea that they were getting tired of becoming content creators. It was a lifestyle portal. I never knew why they hired me anyway. I'm a war correspondent, and they it's diet and Kevin Seitz, or diet and relationships and Kevin Seitz. I never got on the front page. I mean, only one time. And so I think they didn't want to do that kind of reporting because it was really hard to find advertisers.
Yeah.
So, yes.
So I'm wondering if there's any way that prior to said deployment or something like that you could actually learn how to practically apply ethics in an environment like that, or if there's any way that there's any sort of conversation or dialogue that could help you do that, so that like it's not like a split-second decision. Yes.
Read this book. Learn from my mistakes. That's why I'm here. I'm not kidding.
Well, no, just because like you talk about all this stuff, and like I'm sure like it would sink in. I'm sure it's like something that in theory could be practically applied, but like how do you know, and like is there any?
No, great question. You don't know. I mean, when I walked out of Medill News Service, when I got out of here and I graduated, and I started my career at TV 20 News in North Central Florida, I didn't know where it was going to lead. It was all over the place. I started out as on camera, and then I became a producer, and then I ended up in a war zone. And I think that's where not thinking through things can hurt you. You're not going to anticipate every circumstance and every incident. You really won't. So you have to be prepared to be surprised. I think that's probably the key element. But also, not to sound too earnest here, but that's where a journalistic education had some value to me. There were a couple moments, in war zones where the only thing that I had to hang on to was my purpose as a journalist. I had to think, what is my role here? To seek and report the truth. There is a value to that in my society. And if I'm here to do that, I have to do it honestly. And so having an ethics class at one point helped me with that. If I had thought about the concept of putting down the camera and being a human being before I went, maybe that would have been more of an instant reaction than having to deal with the consequences of not having done that. But I would begin to anticipate, like you had mentioned to me, how do you become a war correspondent? Maybe that pathway works for you and you do become a war correspondent. The one thing that isn't taught, or the one thing that we don't anticipate, is what happens when we face a moral dilemma. Prepare yourself for that the same way that you would buy body armor or a Kevlar helmet. You're protecting your body and your core, but are you protecting your head? You know, the human brain is amazingly resilient thing. It's incredibly vulnerable, but amazingly resilient. And it's the one thing that can actually protect you in the war zone. But you've got to use it before you go, not when you're there and not afterwards. I'm the poster child for the afterthought. You know, here's what I did wrong. You don't want to be in this position. You don't want to be up here telling people what you did wrong.
But you didn't go right over. I mean, how did you get from Florida to, you know, the border of Tajikistan and Afghanistan? I mean, so you clearly learned you learned from the ground up. So that must have.
Yeah.
How did that help you in terms of?
I didn't know much about war reporting initially. I mean,
but reporting.
Yeah,
you learned.
definitely. And I did, you know, Medill. You know,
Yeah.
this is a great education for me. My undergrad was a good education, but this was the finishing school. And I feel like the process is every job that you take, you lose a little bit of the stupidity, hopefully. You make a mistake. Someone's trying to Skype me. Sorry. Yeah, I just pulled that. We got your attention now? My Skype isn't even on. You know what? Just shut the. I won't even need that. You can just shut the whole machine down. Yeah, that's. You guys are getting the call, not me.
Oh, we are okay.
Yeah, nobody calls me anymore.
Did you do that or did I?
So, where were we? That was just the president, don't worry.
I can ask another question.
Go ahead, sure.
Okay, I'm wondering if you have any examples from your experiences where you kind of reacted more humanly, as you call it, and that
Did you learn from your mistakes, idiot?
That's not what I meant. What I mean is, like, was there ever an instinct to, like, did you ever have the instinct to put down the camera? And
Okay,
that
I'm gonna.
had an effect on you?
I'm gonna totally confuse you now. Okay.
Please do.
No, I am. It's going to get worse. You're going to walk out of here and really not know what to do at all. Bint Jbeil, 2006, the Israeli 30-day war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. You may remember in that conflict, there had been an airstrike by the Israelis in the town of Cana. 25 children were killed. And I had covered that, and that was a pretty difficult thing to have seen. But the Israelis realized what a PR mess that was, and they called a ceasefire. And so during that time period, that front line, Bint Jbeil, one of the towns that was getting hit constantly, Tyre, all of these places, all the bombing and airstrikes stopped. So we as journalists all went down there to see what did it look like, what was that destruction that happened, and we saw cities or villages that looked pretty leveled. But strangely, we got there right after this thing happened. You started to see people emerge from the rubble. And they weren't young people. These were old people that couldn't get out. They're used to conflict in some ways. They have basements. They're stored with roots and food that they've had down there for a while. And they had survived almost 2 weeks living in their basements, eating roots, surviving on what they had. But they were very weak. A lot of them were dehydrated. So they started coming out, and they started walking through this rubble. There's nobody there yet but journalists. And we're looking at this, and we're going, this is insane. All these people, really weak, some of them falling over. And you're looking, what do you do in this situation? Do you continue to videotape, or do you do something about it? And at that point, most of us that were there slung the cameras, and we picked people up. We threw them over our shoulders or carried them to where some ambulances started coming in. Some Lebanese ambulances came to the roadway, the intersection where the city began, and then we would deliver them there to the ambulances, and they would take them out. There were other journalists that didn't do it that started taking pictures of us. So what happened the next day, I got a call from my boss and said, do you know that your picture was all over the AP with a woman on your back that you were carrying out of this rubble in Ben Jabal? So what could have been inferred from that was that I was sympathizing with Hezbollah or something like that. They didn't name me. I don't think they saw who I was. There were other people that were doing, other journalists as well. And I certainly didn't have any regrets from helping this person. In fact, I heard later from a friend that she was very thankful and had said a lot of nice things about me, made me feel a little bit better for some of the horrible things I had done. But I ended up plastered all over the news. And I already had a sketchy relationship with the Israelis anyway, because I had interviewed some Palestinians at a certain point, a very sensitive point in a conflict. Someone went on my Wikipedia page and said Kevin Seitz is an anti-Semite. You know how you have to kind of scrub that stuff. I said, no, I report fairly. But the further evidence was that I had only been in Lebanon and not in Israel, even though Katyusha rockets were being fired back. I said, I'm not ABC or NBC. We don't have two reporters. I'm it. So I spent 10 days in Lebanon, and then I jumped the border to Israel. But you're looking at, people are looking at this picture. Are you the guy that's carrying, this woman out? So it had consequences for me. Again, I didn't regret it, but I put down the camera and I got involved, like some other people did, and I ended up in the news. So that objectivity was gone, but it created complications. Hopefully, no one looked at my reporting and said, oh, he's a sympathizer or something like that. I would have done it for anybody at that point. Now very clear, I leave no one behind. If someone's got a hangnail, I'm there.
Did your boss give you a hard time for doing that instead of reporting?
Yes, there was a bit of an issue, and the only reason was that Terry Semel was best friends with Bibi Netanyahu. Terry Semel was the head of Yahoo at the time. And they didn't really understand the firewall between news and
Right.
corporate structure anyway.
Right.
So apparently he was getting calls. Why is your reporter only reporting from Lebanon?
No, I mean, but just the simple act of
That not
putting
so
down the
much,
camera,
but I was
"Hey, we're
told
paying
that
you
they
to get
saw
this."
it.
Yeah,
So
right.
now are you more confused? What do we do? God, there's no win. Become a doctor is what I'm telling you. That moral clarity, that's all you're looking for.
The one thing I would say clearly, and again, the class that I teach, we take students out for a weekend in the Shenandoah Mountains to hostile environment training. If you're ever going to go overseas, whether it's a 2-day class or something, there's a bunch of them now popping up all over the place.
Sebastian Junger's doing one of
I
those
was just
things.
going to
So
say Sebastian's doing one because
Yeah.
a lot of his friends got killed, but basically it gives you the basics of not only how to do first aid, but how not to be the loudmouth if you get captured, and
I have
be
to
the
say
first
that-
person that they execute. How to, if you're a woman, there's certain things you need to do. It's invaluable training.
I have to comment on that because that is invaluable. I took hostile environment training after I had been going to war for a few years.
Yeah.
CNN made me take it. And I thought I knew everything, and I realized I didn't know anything. I was making all kinds of mistakes. And we ended up getting captured. I had a small crew just outside of Tikrit. The war was almost over, but Tikrit hadn't fallen yet. We ran a roadblock. We got captured by the Fedayeen. And they started doing all the things that we had been trained might happen. They started separating us. And they said, don't get separated, stay together. And they were taking our translator to one area and us another. And we grabbed him, we hung onto his legs, and we didn't let us get separated because we wouldn't have been able to communicate. And they called him a double traitor, which sounded like that was going to end bad for him. Oh, you're a Kurd, you're here, and you're helping Americans, you're a double traitor. And so they said when you get separated, that's when the rapes happen, that's when people get killed. And so we didn't fight them, but we hung on to him, and he ended up saving our lives. So it was a good investment. Any other questions? Everybody's shell-shocked. Anyway.
Well, I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
You spoke very eloquently about the people that you interviewed for the book. Can you talk about what's happened to them since? Did that help some more than others? Did they all benefit from it? I mean, give us a postscript.
This book, when I started out, I thought was going to be the absolute worst seller ever because it seems so depressing. I'm interviewing these guys, and they're a mess, and I'm a mess. And we're talking, we're kind of sharing our stories, the difficulties that we're having at the moment. I'll give you one example of a specific guy, this guy, James Sperry, he was a Lance Corporal, that got wounded in front of me in Fallujah. And I remember just videotaping him they pulled him off into an alleyway. He had a piece of shrapnel that went through his brain, and they were wrapping him up. And I thought, this is really poignant. I started shooting it, and I saw a rosary hanging out of his pocket. And so I kind of zoom in on the rosary, and I remember thinking, I wonder if he has his faith now, now that he's in this position where he's hurt. And then several years later, when I was doing the Neiman, he sent an email to me. And he said, hey, my name's James Sperry. I was the guy that you videotaped, and you also carried my stretcher out at a certain point. I want to thank you for saving my life. And I wouldn't have my daughter today if it weren't for you. And I'm going, what? I'm hating myself for all the things that I did. And then I realized, remember the guy I said that I left behind? I didn't help the Iraqi man? That same day, I carried an American out on a stretcher because the obstacles to doing that were very small. There was an open space in the stretcher. He was right in front of me. I grabbed it and I moved him. Yeah. And he had seen that article. I wrote about it somewhere. And he said, I want to say, you helped me, so don't feel bad about yourself. And also, I'm wondering, I lost 21 friends over there. Do you have any videotape of them or pictures? And I did. And so we began this dialogue that lasted over a year. And I watched James go through this spiral to one point actually making an effort to commit suicide, and he was institutionalized. And the weirdest, most striking thing about his story was he felt like the shrapnel injury took away his ability to love. His wife came to see him after he had been injured, and he hadn't seen her in such a long time, almost a year from the deployment. He was injured near death after that had happened. And he sees her, and he said he felt like it was a bowling buddy. How you doing? What's going on? He felt nothing for her. And then as time went on, he had a daughter. He said he felt nothing for her either. He felt protective, that he had to take care of them, but no sense of love. And I go, what a horrible thing to lose in this process. Was it organic or psychological? And over time, I just thought James was going to try this again. He would tell me, he would shoot me emails, I'm riding my motorcycle, 160 miles an hour drunk. He's going to kill himself. He's looking for death. And at one point, he lost his marriage, and he sought real help, and he went to the Shepherd Center in Georgia. And he got this combination of Eastern and Western medicine. They started acupuncture with him, meditation, yoga, and they dialed back his meds, which I think was critical. Anytime, a lot of VA doctors, their initial response to any symptom is, you're depressed, antidepressant. You can't sleep, sleep medication. Anxiety, here's anxiety medication. Drugs have interreactions. They create issues for you, and they create such a fog that you can't even think straight. On top of it, some of the soldiers, some of the Marines start scoring drugs on the outside, methadone, whatever else to help them feel a little bit better or numb them even more. And so those drug interactions can be very deadly. They weaned him off of that stuff. The Eastern medicine that he was taking, the therapy that he was going through, turned him around to the point where, when I saw him the first time I interviewed him after the incident, he looked like an old man. He was 23 and he looked ancient. And then I just saw him. He did an interview with me at KTLA in Los Angeles, and he looks great. He's strong. He's got his confidence back. Still has migraines and so on. But he's found purpose in his life, and the purpose is reaching back over and helping other wounded veterans. He became part of the Wounded Warrior Regiment, and he founded an organization called The Fight Continues, where he helps Marines and soldiers in transition. As soon as they get back, how do we talk them back into peacetime society? And he's been invited to the White House twice. He went to the inaugural. So he is that success story that anchors this, that proves with the proper intervention, we really can come back, regardless of how bad the experience. He had both guilt from killing and survivor's guilt, but is able to live a functioning, purposeful life. He said, I feel like I was spared for this reason. So that's one of those great stories. Not all of them are like that, unfortunately. The first chapter in here, William Wall, I'm not going to tell you all the details of it, but it's a much sadder story. Individual that I met that did reveal so much to me. I interviewed him literally minutes after he had just killed 6 guys in a firefight. And he was kind of juiced up on the adrenaline, but started speaking his heart. You know how difficult it is to interview soldiers and cops. They close down, they start speaking in cop speak or military speak. He just was as candid as can be and left this legacy, even though he's dead now, of what it was like to kill. The whole transcript is in here because it was just too powerful to take out. So, yes?
Last night, when the whole thing was going on in California with
With Dorner? Yeah.
Great sort of reality violence TV show, right? And actually CNN tweeted
Right.
They want you to tune in CNN to listen to the gunfire.
Yeah.
And all the conversation we've been having in this country lately about gun violence and the influences that lead to 17-year-old kids wanting to be paramilitary mass murderers. We talk about movies and entertainment.
Yep.
We talk about video games and gun availability. What do you think about the news media's responsibility in the way that we present, talk about violence like this in war? Like you were saying earlier that, you know, you even went into it thinking, hey, it's going to be kind of a trick. And of course, you know, then you find out for real is that it's actually not that great. So I'm just wondering, I mean, is there that part of the discussion about gun violence in the country has not come up? I'm just wondering, maybe there hasn't.
No, I mean, see, that's the complexity of it. I mean, the analogy that I would make on this is that, you know, there was a time period when they were making films like Reefer Madness, you know, where people are having a puff of a joint and they're jumping out of a window. You know, that kind of hysterical reporting wasn't accurate. You know, for some people, pot is very bad for you. Maybe it makes you unmotivated. Maybe it leads. Maybe it could be a gateway. Not for everybody. And I think war experiences are multidimensional as well. That if we say everything's bad in them, we're going to somehow stop the dialogue from happening. There are guys coming back feeling very powerful. You know, maybe it wasn't even killing. Maybe it was just doing something good, leading their men in a way that was brave. Maybe they saved lives, didn't take them. Maybe they did something that they felt very proud of. And I want that to be part of the dialogue and not just say war is bad. You know, ultimately when we start fighting, you know, there's a failure in society, not just with those guys. But it's multidimensional. And when we talk about gun violence, I think that, yes, we're focusing only on one part of the conversation, which is only the sensational part of the conversation. That part where the drama is so great that we're going to play it up and we're going to suck in all the viewers that we possibly can without explaining what's actually happened there. There's a dilemma, though. How do we get the viewers that we need to talk about real stories and to bring meaning to them when so often they tune us out when we begin speaking about those serious issues? They are drawn to the violence. And when you say, you know, listen to the gunfire, our ears all peak up. Mine does too. It doesn't mean it's good reporting. It isn't necessarily. It's highlighting one end of it. And the dilemma is, how do we bring those stories together with meaning while understanding that there is a sensational element to it? But can we ignore the sensational completely, or do we just have to diminish it somewhat? And I don't know what the answer is. I think that for the most part, our default has been that we go to the shallow end of the pool, you know, in reporting this. We use the sensational and we forget the message. Hollywood has found a way, like something like Zero Dark 30 or Mississippi Burning. We look at these things, historically inaccurate, but finding a way to fuse together some factual events and tell us a story that keeps us entertained. Can we do that in journalism without fictionalizing things? You know, could we have told the story of Zero Dark 30 completely factual and kept everybody's interest? Could we have told the story of Mississippi Burning the same way? Can we tell the story of Dorner without sensationalizing it and try to understand? Is this a story about race? Is it a story about the economy? Or just, you know, someone that has gone off the deep end and is murdering people? You know, is there more to it? And quite frankly, with our 24-hour news cycle, we don't have time to think this stuff out. I don't know. Are you guys exploring that here? How do we bring those elements together and stories that we normally don't want to listen to?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we are. It's very hard to do. I mean, we're looking at all different kinds of digital platforms. I mean, one of the reasons we do these projects every year is to try to figure out new technologies and techniques to use to do it. But I think in some ways it's just the story you have to tell that enables you to do that. I mean, I just spent a couple of years co-writing a book about the secret decade-long hunt for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And unlike Zero Dark 30, we actually did have two characters, two FBI agents who chased, you know, this 9/11 mastermind from 1993 to 2001 were worried that he was going to do something horrible, but they lost him, and then they found out that he did 9/11. So, we're a little surprised that Zero Dark 30
I was going to say
is
that
such a
that's
great
incredibly
movie.
drama.
They literally had to make up that character when
You
have this other
existed
story
somewhere
where
else.
we wouldn't have to make it up, but so it depends on the story. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe they'll, Catherine Bigelow will buy our book and make that into.
Well, who's it? Bull? Didn't he just start a production company in New York that's trying to look for journalism projects? So maybe we should both go out there.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but.
We have to find another way to get paid anyways.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think it depends on when they said they were doing a movie about the Bin Laden raid, my first thought, because I covered terrorism for 10 years at the LA Times, was how are they going to do that when there's no redeeming protagonist?
Right. Yeah.
And so they, the woman that is most closely that character Maya is based on is fairly reprehensible, if you ask
That's what I
anybody.
heard, yeah.
And she doesn't look at all like Jessica Chastain, and she made some mistakes along the way.
Shocking.
She's mentioned in our book as a woman who flew over to Poland just to watch KSM be waterboarded because she got a kick out of it. And so anyway,
Redeeming qualities.
Hollywood has the ability to
Yeah,
create myths, I guess.
it is. It's very strange, and it can be infuriating when you look at you have a story that's real,
Right.
that has all the elements that Hollywood wants, but it doesn't become their story. And I don't know. At certain points, I've waved the white flag, and I wondered what the limitations of journalism are. Are we a society that doesn't really care anymore? And I don't want to blame everybody. I mean, back to your question though, is the thing I forgot to address. Viewers are part of the problem as well. They tell us this is what we want. It's not that we have to listen to their every whim, treat them like infants, but by the numbers, that's what they teach us. When you look at the number of clicks, the number of unique views on a site, Yahoo used to do with that. With me, I would do a story, what I thought was somewhat complex and interesting, had dramatic elements, and the click rate was very low. I did a story on an Afghan child bride that hit all of the points that everybody loved. This is, someone in an Arabic, or I'm sorry, not an Arabic country, in a Muslim country that is being mistreated, and just all those kind of stereotypical touch points, and it got 9 million views. Our biggest story ever.
Yeah.
And part of it is driven by that click rate, which is it's a problem.
I mean, speaking of that, do you see other people now doing what you were doing back then? It almost seems like it was so pioneering that I mean, I don't see a lot of that now. What do you cite as some of the best examples of new digital journalism that people should look at these days, and why do you think there's not more? Is it just not
There are
commercially?
there are a lot of young journalists out there doing this, the stuff that you see from Syria and stuff, but almost just as much you see them getting captured, and it becomes a story a lot. And I want to think the best. I know that James Foley, who's a Medill alum as well, is he still in Syria? Okay, yeah. He did good work. He's been doing some he did good reporting there before he got captured, and he was also in Libya. Did some good reporting, got captured there. But you see other people that maybe don't have the chops, that are just going over there and muddling into something.
Yeah.
So I don't know, and I don't know what the answer is on that. I think that we are finding new storytelling platforms that are almost being done outside of those conflict zones. They're so hot, they're drawing people into them. So the people that are developing new storytelling ideas are people like Brian Storm, Storm Media, where you're combining the best elements of still photography, video, narrative journalism, but you're doing that not necessarily in a war zone. You're doing it in kind of these longer form documentary pieces, and I really love that stuff. But in terms of the reporting that's coming out of there, you look at people like C.J. Chivers from the New York Times. He is just a yeoman reporter, but he doesn't shoot pictures. He reports. That is that old school, but it's amazing reporting because he's tracking weaponry. All over the stuff that that was lost in Libya is now finding its way into Mali, according to some of his reporting. And that kind of beat reporting, it's amazing, and we need more of that. And I don't want C.J. Chivers to actually pick up a video camera. I want him to do exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
So.
We have time for one more.
Kevin, could you touch upon say, a success story, one of these countries that you visited, it was a war zone at the time,
Yeah.
and how the journalism and being in country reporting on what was taking place helped, and now perhaps it's a calm situation, they move forward with the situation, due to the reporting that was done on the ground by yourself and others.
Good question. I'm not sure the reporting has changed anything in these conflicts. I think it certainly made people aware of during the Arab Spring. We saw what was going on in Iran. We saw what was going on in Egypt, and maybe it gave social media more credit than it deserved. That was touching certainly a portion of the population, but it was a better off portion of the population, someone more likely to support those uprisings anyway. But the places that I actually saw change, I saw change in Nepal from the time that I was there. There was a Maoist guerrilla uprising there that lasted a number of years. And while I was reporting there, it had nothing to do with my reporting, there was a transition from war to peace. There was a disarmament that happened. And it was the only place that I went to that there was a disarmament happening. It was interesting to report somewhat good news, that they were becoming part of the government. And I don't know if our reporting has anything to do with helping that transition happen, but maybe it can help to sustain the transition. That transparency that continues to live on after the conflict is gone, to make those parliamentary meetings public, to expose the process, maybe keeps democracy alive there. But I think we get very muddled during the conflict process. There's so much going on that it's difficult to discern what the outcome is going to be. And I think sometimes the more ugly conflicts maybe can get their acts cleaned up by the exposure. When you look at things like what's been happening in the Congo, rape has been used as a weapon of war. Now, that hasn't changed dramatically yet, but there's been a focus on that. There's been some celebrities taking interest in the region. The UN has done better reporting on that. And now we know what's happening and people are telling their stories. Perhaps that dials back some of that kind of violence. I don't know if there's numbers to support that yet, but at least we know about it. Darfur may be the best example of celebrity and media involvement that forced the government of Sudan to realize that there will be a price for burning down villages and letting that kind of thing happen, because more people are watching. That's probably the only examples that I can think of right now. So.
Yeah, you need a good celebrity.
You need Bono. Bono can save the world.
George Clooney.
Oh yeah, Clooney or Bono. So.
You want to take one more? Is there anybody?
Yeah, if you don't have any questions or you think of something later, let me give you my email address. And also the website has some amazing video about the stories I talked to you about. You really should take a look at it. Some of it's really disturbing. The Willie Wald stuff, there's a lot of dead bodies in the beginning. If that's something that's hard for you, roll past that, but watch his interview. It's www.kevinsitesreports.com. That's the website, Kevin Sites Reports, KEVINSITES reports.com. A lot of my videos are up there, links to the book and so on. But thanks for the time and the opportunity. Love being back. It's great. You guys got better toys than we did when I was here.
Thank you.